Ladies and gentlemen, can I thank each and every one of you for coming along this afternoon to hear a little bit about Jack Kennedy, Reg Evans, and the Coast Watchers of the Second World War. I'm a bit worried. Where's my friend Bob from the Winchcombe Castle? Where are you, Bob? Now, Bob said to me, "Don't speak too long, Brett. I didn't come to hear you. I came to have afternoon tea and speak to my friends." So, hold me to it, Bob. Hold me to it. I would like to acknowledge our President, Robert Allen, and Robert's executive for all the work you do to promote our history. It's very important. And Robert, also your warm advice about today as well. And your past president, Desley Garnett, who invited me all those months ago. Desley, so thank you. I'm finally here, so thank you. I should also acknowledge my old friend, Councillor Vicky Howard. Vicky, very, very good to see you. My old mate Eugene White's here. I saw Mogo Gates before. And where's the wonderful Claire Moore? She's always hiding. Claire Moore, my former parliamentary colleague. It's good to see you, Claire. And also Arthur Shrenkoff, who was the guy outside before selling the books. But Arthur's not only a bookseller, he's also a book writer. And without him, there wouldn't be any books. Ladies and gentlemen, my remarks today are based on the book Saving Lieutenant Kennedy, the heroic story of the Australian who helped rescue JFK. At the very heart of this book is the story of how an Australian bookkeeper turned coast watcher, Reg Evans, helped find and rescue an American naval officer, Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, later the President of the United States. But it's more than that, as you alluded to, Robert. It's about how Australia discovered America and America discovered Australia. And that relationship has mattered ever since. Let me tell you about it. Let's all go back to the Second World War. And let me start where I finish the book that I wrote. So let me start at the end of the book. This book started with a look out my window. These days, Brisbane River's foreshore welcomes joggers, cyclists and strollers. And the river's peace is only occasionally broken by a city cat. But 80 years ago, Capricorn Wharf, in what is now the suburb of Tenerife, and was then New Farm, was a base for dozens of US submarines and some 800 American service personnel. Ships of the Pensacola convoy docked just a few hundred metres further downstream from my window. Even today, Brisbane, like many other towns and cities around Australia, is full of reminders of those often dark days of the Second World War. We are surrounded by stories just waiting to be told. During the Second World War, Brisbane was a garrison city and popularly called the American Village. It was the headquarters of General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific area. Just outside my window, American and Australian submarines were repaired, refitted and relaunched. And Jared Benjamin knows all about that. It was from Brisbane that Australia's and the United States fight back against Japanese aggression was planned and organised. It all started from this city. Within a few weeks of Japan bombing the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, Japan threatened Australia. It threatened our homeland. The Japanese bombed Darwin in February of 1942 and soon occupied some of Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands to the northeast of Australia. In doing so, Japan hoped to separate Australia from the United States by occupying the Solomon Islands. Let me tell you one story from that conflict. Let's go back 82 years to a moonless and a foggy night on the 2nd of August 1943. US Navy Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, the future president, was on patrol. He was on patrol in enemy waters in the Solomon Islands as part of a group of 15 patrol torpedo boats, PT boats for short, sent to intercept what the Australians and the Americans referred to as the Tokyo Express, which were Japanese destroyers and transport ships resupplying Japanese bases in the Solomon Islands. So Japanese ships would be run up and down the Solomon Islands, resupplying Japanese bases. At about 2:30 in the morning, as he was idling on just one engine, the torpedo boat that Kennedy commanded, PT-109, was rammed by a Japanese destroyer and cut in two. Immediately, the crash killed 2 of Kennedy's crew and left the other 10 precariously clinging to wreckage within sight of the Japanese encampments. Pretty hairy, pretty scary. After drifting for some 15 hours in the water and with the wreckage beginning to sink, young Jack Kennedy led the survivors to a small island, later named Kennedy Island, saving a badly burned crewman by biting on the strap of his life jacket. He bit on it, and then he paddled all the way to an island, several miles to an island. Not easy to do, but fortunately it didn't ship the famous Kennedy smile. Kennedy's heroism, his wartime heroism, first made his public name, and after the war very much paved his way into politics. First into the House of Representatives, then the Senate, and ultimately, of course, the presidency. His bravery was at the very core of his campaigning, and it distinguished him from most of the other candidates. But missing, presumed dead, behind enemy lines, with no food or water, with several injured, Kennedy and his men are unlikely to have survived to eventually return home, if not for the very fortunate presence of an Australian Coast Watcher, Lieutenant Reg Evans, who witnessed the aftermath of the collision from his nearby jungle hideaway. He saw that. What was Evans doing? What was he doing on the island hideaway, behind enemy lines in the Solomon Islands? In any case, who were these Coast Watchers? Who were they? The Coast Watchers were essentially intelligence officers observing and reporting enemy activity behind enemy lines, hidden often within a very short walk of Japanese bases and encampments and soldiers. They were very nearby, and they reported back about Japanese military movements. As Reg Evans himself described it, a Coast Watcher's work is to sit in hiding like a spider, right in the web of the enemy, unseen and unheard. We became, he said, the eyes and the ears of the Pacific. But it was dangerous work. Commander Eric Felt, and I think at one stage Dr. Betty Lee may have addressed you. And Betty Lee, of course, is the grandniece of Eric Felt. Commander Felt built up the Coast Watchers before the Second World War, and he would say to volunteers, Eric Felt, all I can promise you is the promise of certain peril. If you were captured, the best you could hope for was a quick death. But if that were bad enough for the Australian Coast Watchers, just think of the danger to the islanders, the Solomon Islanders, who are assisting the Australians. If they were caught by the Japanese aiding the enemy, not only would they have been killed, but their entire family or entire village might have been killed, just like the partisans were in Europe. It was indeed perilous. But before the era of satellites and surveillance drones, the Coast Watchers provided crucial intelligence about Japanese military movements and very often pre-warned of incoming attacks by the Japanese, which enabled the Allies to prepare in time. So, for example, in the Battle for Guadalcanal, which is one of the turning points in the War of the Pacific, Australian Coast Watchers gave the Americans 2 hours' notice. 2 hours' notice of the arrival of Japanese bombers. Australian Coast Watchers in Bougainville, so this is to the north of Guadalcanal, saw the bombers on their way overhead to Guadalcanal and radioed their warning, giving the Americans 2 hours' notice. These were critical warnings in the opening stages of the battle and allowed the Americans to maintain their foothold on Guadalcanal. As US Admiral William Halsey summed it up, the Coast Watchers saved Guadalcanal and Guadalcanal saved the Pacific. Reg Evans was a Coast Watcher, and they were quickly becoming legends in the Pacific. On this night, 2nd of August 1943, secreted in his mountaintop lookout on Kolombangara Island, he saw the immediate aftermath of the ramming of PT-109 by the Japanese destroyer. He could see fire on the water, but peering through his telescope, he wasn't sure if he could see any survivors. Evans, originally from Sydney, but who had before the war worked in the Pacific Islands as a bookkeeper, quickly alerted the Solomon Islander scouts who he worked with, and with courage, great courage, and I have to say with some luck, the scouts managed to find the PT-109 castaways 3 days later. Kennedy was then taken by the scouts to see Evans hidden under palm fronds in the bottom of a canoe so the Japanese pilots wouldn't spot, a white guy in a canoe with Solomon Islanders. So can you imagine, ladies and gentlemen, can you imagine the scene? Just as the canoe came towards the beach, Kennedy jumped out into the surf and seeing Reg Evans waiting for him on shore, said with much relief, "Man, am I glad to see you." Evans, sizing up this skinny, bedraggled, sunburned, unshaven and exhausted young American, shook his hand and said, "And I'm bloody glad to see you too, mate." They spent the next 2 hours in Evans' secret camp, drinking tea and planning, of course, the rescue of the rest of Kennedy's crew. The rest, as they say, is history, and for Kennedy and his surviving men, it had a very happy ending. Evans coordinating with the United States Navy the pickup of the crew of PT-109 on the following night. Kennedy, for the rest of his life, remembered with great fondness and gratitude his rescuers and hoped one day to meet them all again. The problem was that Kennedy misremembered Evans' name. Gets worse. And so the Coast Watcher was misnamed, and even worse, misidentified as a New Zealander. For all those Kiwis here, I apologise. That was in all the retellings of the post-war retellings of the rescue. Evans himself was actually too modest to correct the record. But as Kennedy was running for president, of course, in 1960, he eventually outed himself publicly as the man responsible because everyone was trying to find who was the guy who, saved Kennedy. By the time the Australian Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, met with President Kennedy on the 24th of February 1961, Evans by then had been properly identified, prompting President Kennedy to tell Menzies that Australia was responsible in a way for my administration. As Menzies and Kennedy had never met before, this was I think it's fair to say, a choice icebreaker. Later that year, Reg Evans himself came to the United States as a bit of a celebrity. Hard to believe, but yes. He appeared on nationally syndicated television programs, which you can watch on television, chat shows and quiz shows. And one of them I remember, people remember Betty White? Yes. Betty White's in one of them, but sadly she makes mistakes and gets it all wrong. But she was there, and you can watch them on YouTube today. And then on the 1st of May, Evans met with President Kennedy in the Oval Office for about 30 minutes, 20 of them in private, which is an honour, isn't it? Evans recorded that he felt at home with President Kennedy from the first moment, and he paid Kennedy the ultimate compliment. He wrote, "We chatted on, the two of us, just like old coppers." The following year, 1962, one of the Solomon Islander scouts, Benjamin Kevu, also visited the United States and had a chance to meet President Kennedy. Kevu's visit took place during the America's Cup yacht race, where, I don't know if anyone remembers here, but where Australia was challenging for the first time with Sir Frank Packer's yacht Gretel. It's a long time ago, I know, but some of you may remember that, representing the Royal Sydney Yacht Squadron. Well, Australia lost, but President Kennedy took time from the brewing Cuban Missile Crisis, you'll all remember that if you were around, to watch several of the races. And at the official dinner, he spoke very warmly about, this is what he said, our friends from Australia, this extraordinary group of men and women numbering some 10 million who are bound to an ocean to the United States, and concluding, so beyond this race, beyond the result, rests this happy relationship between two great peoples. In fact, President Kennedy was planning to come to Australia, initially in late 1963 and then in 1964. And some in the public service weren't happy. And in fact, I went to Canberra to look at the relevant public service files in the archives. You'd like this, Jared. This would be your thing. And the chief ceremonial officer of the Department of the Prime Minister wrote to the head of the department suggesting that a visit by President Kennedy couldn't be accommodated. It could not be accommodated in the Australian spring of 1964 because there were already too many visits. The Prime Minister of Japan, the Queen Mother, and the Maharaja of Mysore. But as we know, the plans got at first delayed, and then, of course, President Kennedy's tragic death in November 1963 ended the possibility. And I always think in my mind's eye, probably because I'm somewhat of a romantic, as Queen Elizabeth had visited Australia in 1963, and the Beatles, of course, came in 1964, if Kennedy's visit had taken place, I think it would have been a cross between a royal visit and Beatlemania. He would have been the first sitting US president to come to Australia. And I remember the ruckus as a little boy in Canberra in 1966 when President Johnson, during the LBJ, came. And it was like the visit of the Holy Roman Emperor. There were people everywhere. People will remember that. It was a huge deal. And in fact, it's one of my earliest memories as a little boy. Would you indulge me if I conclude on a couple of personal reflections? One of the highlights, Mr. President, of researching and writing this book was meeting Jim Burrows, then one of the last two surviving coast watchers from the Second World War. I spent more than an hour with him and his wife Beryl in 2022. He was sharp, very witty and engaging, wicked sense of humour at the age of 99. He passed away in July last year at the age of 101. So you've got a long way to go, Eugene. What struck me was his optimism and his gratitude. And we could do with a bit of that today. very optimistic, and he was very grateful. He told me he never worried about dying or losing the war. He reckons Australians are the luckiest people on the planet. He was an inspiration. And another highlight, which was more personal, if I can say that. My mother's uncle, Lieutenant Frank Barrett, DCM, initially served with the 2nd AIF in Tobruk and then in Greece, and he was taken prisoner by the Germans. And he escaped en route to Austria. He jumped from the train to another train going south, and you know what? He didn't even know where the train was going. But he ended up in Belgrade. And miraculously, he made it all the way from Belgrade, all the way back to Palestine to rejoin his unit. And he was awarded the DCM for doing so. And then he got back to Australia. I would have thought that would be enough. He was injured and he was given the DCM by Frank Ford, acting Prime Minister, Frank Ford. And of Queensland, you're quite right, Robert. And he signed up again for more service. And my dear mother, who is still with us in her late 80s, met him in Hague Road, Milton, down the road here, Hague Road, Milton. And Frank, from that family gathering, was taken away by the Americans and was killed 4 weeks later in New Britain, off the islands in Papua New Guinea, killed by the Japanese. And his name appears today as one of the fallen coast watchers on the Coast Watchers Memorial Lighthouse at Madang in Papua New Guinea. He did all that, then joined the Coast Watchers, then was killed. He was age 32. So I dedicated this book to Frank Barrett and to my late father. And just to wrap it up, ladies and gentlemen, on the 10th of August 2025, and Gerard was here for this, and indeed Councillor Howard, the Lord Mayor of Brisbane, Councillor Adrian Schrinner, unveiled the first plaque in Australia dedicated to the memory and bravery of our World War II Coast Watchers. The memorial is on the Brisbane River at Newstead, not far from Newstead House and not far from my window. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brett. Just before, I'm going to ask for a question, but I just wanted to make one comment. There's an old saying in politics, all politics is local. You would have heard that one. But I think listening to you talk today, you could also safely say that all history is local, because what you've done is use personalities and real people and told their stories in a very affecting way. And like your wiki entry, you leave us wanting more. And there'll be more, and you can buy the book, and I'm sure he'll be happy to sign it for you afterwards if you want to know more about this gripping story. So thank you very much.